Right, good evening everyone. Delighted to see you all here for the first meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for this session. My name is Ian Rolston. I'm the current president of the Society, and long ago I used to be a professor of archaeology at Edinburgh University. We've got, as is ever the case, a little bit of formal business to go through to start with before I introduce the speaker. I should also welcome those online who are following our deliberations this evening right round the world. So welcome whatever time of day it is with you. But without more ado, can I ask Dr. Sanders to do the formal business of the evening?
Hello everyone. Minutes of meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland held at 6 p.m. in the Augustine United Church, George IV Bridge, Edinburgh, and on Zoom. Ian Ralston, President of the Society, in the chair. The minutes of the previous Society of Antiquaries of Scotland lecture meeting were read and approved. The following communications were read. Results of spring fellowship election. All 51 proposed fellows were elected. Followed by 2 short lectures by PhD graduates from the University of Glasgow. The medieval music of the Inchcolm Office for St Columba by Dr. Andrew Bull, followed by a short question and answer session. And Applecross, a multicultural monastic foundation by Dr. Carolyn McNamara, followed by a short question and answer session. And we only have a few notices before we get to the lecture. First of all, big apologies from the director, Dr. Simon Gilmore, who can't be with you today. However, it does give me the opportunity of test driving our rather natty Society of Antiquaries tie. And both this version and the tartan version are there for your perusal at the back or on the website. And we also have a range of scarves too, which is particularly apt given the wintry conditions. Christmas is on its way, and of course we've got our anniversary meeting, an AGM coming up at the end of November. So please do have a look and particularly check out the Society tartan. Advertisement over. The only other 2 notices to give are a big thank you to the 14 fellows who've put themselves forward for election for the 2 spots for Society Council, which I think is a record and speaks really well to the enthusiasm and engagement of the fellowship. And also a big thank you to all of our fellows for spreading the word and attracting new people who want to join the fellowship. We've got 65 new fellows applications in, which will be voted on at the anniversary meeting AGM. So a big thank you to fellows and to staff, particularly the fellowship and development team, Andrea and Jade. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Right, well, I'm delighted this evening to welcome Dr. Rachel Delman to give us a lecture. Dr. Delman was in Edinburgh holding a Susan Manning Fellowship in the Institute for the Advanced Studies in the Humanities, also held a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship in York, and is a graduate of Nottingham, Cambridge, and for her DPhil, Oxford. She now works for Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. She has a number of papers in print deriving from her doctorate and from other work, and a book under contract with Oxford University Press. So we're delighted to welcome her tonight and to speak to us on the topic of Mary of Guelders and the architecture of Queenship in 15th century Scotland. Dr. Delman, you're welcome.
So thank you so much for the kind introduction and to the Society for inviting me to be here this evening. It's such an honour to be here and to be able to share my research with you all. I'd also like to say thank you to Simon Gilmore, who we've heard couldn't be here this evening, and also to Jade Dent over there, who's been working incredibly hard behind the scenes. So yeah, thank you, Jade, for all your help with the logistics. So yeah, thank you all for coming out on this dark and drizzly evening, and thank you to the online audience as well for attending. So as mentioned, the research on which this lecture is based is due to come out well, actually, I'm not sure if that's mentioned. There was sort of general talk about my articles, but this specific part of my research is due to come out as an article in the Scottish Historical Review shortly. And as was mentioned, this research was carried out during my time as Susan Manning Fellow at IASH in Edinburgh, so it's lovely to be back again. So in 1460, the 29-year-old King of Scotland, James II, died unexpectedly at Roxburgh Castle when one of his own cannons tragically exploded and killed him. In his wake, James left behind his queen consort, Mary of Guelders, as well as the couple's 9-year-old son and heir to the throne, James III, and his siblings. Upon her husband's death, the Queen, who was at this point in her late 20s, acted quickly to ensure the smooth transition of power to her eldest son. Mary continued the siege at Roxburgh Castle, and just days after the Scots' victory against the English, she oversaw the coronation of the young James III at the nearby Kelso Abbey. Over the next 3 years until her death in 1463, Mary effectively ruled Scotland as regent. During that time, she was also a prolific patron of architecture, founding Trinity Collegiate Kirk and Hospital on the outskirts of Edinburgh, commissioning Ravenscraig Castle on the coast of Kirkcaldy in Fife, and renovating her personal apartments at the nearby Falkland Palace. Recent dendrochronology or tree ring dating carried out on the internal timber-framed structure supporting the iconic crown spire of what's today St Giles Cathedral also points to her involvement in the works there. So in my lecture this evening, I'm going to take you on a tour around Edinburgh and Fife to consider the ways in which Mary's building projects, both individually and collectively, articulated messages regarding her gender, piety, power, and status as Queen of Scotland during her son's minority. But first things first then, who was Mary and how did she become Queen of Scotland? So on the 18th of June 1449, the 15-year-old Mary of Guelders first stepped onto the shores of Leith to the northeast of Edinburgh ahead of her marriage to James II at Holyrood Palace. And I should just say here that unfortunately we don't have any contemporary images. As with many medieval women, we don't have a contemporary image of Mary of Guelders. So this one's taken from the Seaton Armorial in the 16th century. This is the earliest one we have. So Mary had been born in Guelders in modern-day Holland in around 1434 to Catherine of Cleves and Arnold, Duke of Guelders. At the age of 9, she moved to the Burgundian court of her great-uncle, Philip the Good, and his wife, Isabella of Portugal, in Burgundy, where she was raised in the Duchess's household. And I'll come back to Isabella later on in my paper this evening, but it's worth saying here that she was a highly educated woman, and by the looks of it, someone who you wouldn't want to cross. Isabella participated in political negotiations and maintained influential networks throughout Europe. And as a result, the young Mary received an excellent education, which likely prepared her for her later role as the head of Scotland's government. Now, Philip the Good and Isabella of Burgundy had no legitimate daughters of their own, so they instead used the marriages of their great nieces, Mary included, as a way of consolidating alliances across Europe. Mary was eventually destined for Scotland, and in the summer of 1449, as I've said, she married James II at Holyrood. Now, the marriage was considered a success in dynastic terms. Assisted by the shirt relic of the 11th century Queen of Scots, St Margaret, Mary gave birth to 2 surviving sons and 3 daughters. And Mary's uncle, the Duke of Burgundy, certainly appears to have been pleased with the match, because in 1457 he sent James Mons Meg, which can still be seen, as you all know, at Edinburgh Castle today. So the King and Queen appear to have had a harmonious and functioning partnership. James gave Mary considerable lands through which she acquired independent wealth. Mary also played a particularly active role in her husband's first parliament of 1450. 4 years later, the Queen was also present at the siege of Blackness Castle, which James afterwards gave her as a gift to celebrate the Scots' victory. The couple was involved in charitable and pious works too. including the foundation of a hospital at Fale near Glasgow. During their marriage, Mary, like many medieval women, largely remains hidden behind the actions of her husband in the written evidence, but we do also get some glimpses of her independent activities as consort. So it was reportedly due to her influence that the observant Franciscans first arrived in Scotland in 1457, and she's also known to have given generously to 6 poor men outside the gates of Stirling Castle. And the image I've chosen here on the screen is taken from a prayer book owned by Mary's mother, Catherine of Cleves. And this is a very famous and beautiful illuminated prayer book which shows Catherine giving alms to the poor. So here we see Mary's mother being portrayed very much as a sort of paragon of feminine virtue. And this is worth noting because this book would have been used to educate the young Mary. So she would have been exposed to these images of sort of exemplary feminine piety and no doubt learned from them. So we do get some sense of Mary's piety and her interest in patronage during her marriage. But it's really once James dies that she steps into the limelight and becomes visible to us in the historical record as a prolific architectural patron. And it's Mary's building projects during her 3 years as a widow that I'm going to focus on this evening. But before I do that, I think it's important for us to get some of the backdrop against which Mary began her building efforts in 1460. So following her husband's death, Mary's position was far from certain. In late medieval Scotland, custody of the king did not automatically equate to political power, or indeed ensure Mary's governance over the kingdom as regent. This had become acutely apparent 2 decades earlier, when Mary's predecessor, Joan Beaufort, had lost the custody of her son, the king, almost immediately after the murder of her husband, James I. Across the border in England, Mary's contemporary Margaret of Anjou had also recently made a failed bid for regency in response to the infirmity of her husband, Henry VI, the events of which sparked a civil war that is now known to history as the Wars of the Roses. The turbulence following the murder of James I in 1437 and the ongoing civil war just across the border in England undoubtedly shaped how the Scottish court and government, and indeed Mary herself, responded to the sudden death of James II. And while Mary's circumstances were a bit better than those of Joan Beaufort, in that she had greater resources and she didn't face a fractured political community, that's not to say that she was without her detractors. So like Joan Beaufort and Margaret of Anjou, Mary was a foreign-born queen consort who lacked established networks in her marital home, and whose only natural allies were her own children. And it's perhaps for that reason that the Queen of Scots accordingly surrounded herself with allies and supporters, appointing her own men as keepers of vital castles, including Edinburgh, Stirling, Blackness and Dunbar, and making one of her personal favourites, James Lindsay of Covington, keeper of the Privy Seal. Now, Mary's role as a widow of the king and as a governor to the young heir to the throne and kingdom also enhanced her position for sort of materially expressing her status. It's clear to us that the Queen made the most of her position and her circumstances, commissioning a series of building projects which commenced shortly after her husband's death. Oh, bit too far. So we'll go back to this slide again. And here we can see each of those projects represented on the map. So the concentration of Mary's works in and around Edinburgh, which had become Scotland's political and administrative centre following the assassination of James I at Perth in 1437, as well as the neighbouring earldom of Fife, which Mary had received in the previous decade, actually, as part of her marriage settlement, publicly marked her presence as the head of Scotland's government and the mother of the king. Now, Mary is quite unusual in that if we compare her to the Stuart queens who preceded her, she really stands out for her architectural patronage. Yet as a cosmopolitan queen, she would have been aware of the ways in which artistic and architectural patronage were used by her European contemporaries to convey messages of power. Mary knew several women who were leading patrons of the arts. So her formidable great-aunt, Duchess Isabella, for example, who we saw just now, she was a prolific patron of art and architecture, and she closely supported the foundation of several religious orders and buildings, including the refurbishment of the Hospital of St Jacques in Lille, which involved rebuilding a wing for housing poor pilgrims and adding a maternity hospital for poor women. Isabella also played a key role in commemorating members of both her natal and marital families through her creation of several magnificent tomb effigies. Mary's mother, Catherine of Cleves, also commissioned the beautiful prayer book that we've seen, which is often described actually as the greatest Dutch illuminated manuscript in the world. And as I said before, Mary would have read this book with her mother, so she would have been sort of influenced by these ideas, and she would have seen her mother as a patron of the arts. Across the border, the French-born Queen Consort of England, Margaret of Anjou, also showed a strong interest in literary and architectural patronage. But aside from her mother, her great-aunt, and her queenly contemporary, it's worth pointing out that another woman, this time a little closer to home, may have also inspired Mary's decision to build. As I mentioned earlier, when she was in labour, Mary requested the shirt of the 11th century Queen of Scots, St Margaret. Renowned for her piety, Margaret also showed a keen interest in architectural patronage, founding Dunfermline Abbey in Fife, which was dedicated to the Holy Trinity, and I'll come back to the significance of that in just a moment, and famously building lodgings and establishing a crossing for pilgrims at the shrine, of St Andrews, which is why, as many of you will know, we still have the name Queen's Ferry Crossing to this day. Now, what I'm not saying is that Mary was necessarily directly emulating these women when she embarked upon her programme of architectural patronage, but what I do want to suggest is that she was aware and indeed part of this wider medieval culture in which women were acting as leading patrons of art and architecture. So now then, I want to consider each of Mary's building projects in turn to explore the way in which she personally deployed the built environment to articulate a range of messages regarding her newfound position of power in 1460. So first up then, let's turn to Trinity Collegiate Kirk and Hospital. So if you happen to venture off the Royal Mile down Chalmers Close, which is one of those small capillary streets radiating down towards Waverley train station, you'll be confronted with a pretty bizarre sight. And that's the remains of part of a 15th century Gothic chapel, juxtaposed against the significantly less picturesque 90s facade of the budget hotel Jury's Inn. Now, you might think that this is quite an odd location for a 15th century chapel, in which case you'd be right. So the building that you now see on Chalmers Close is a rebuilt section of a larger chapel that once stood on the site now occupied by Waverley train station. And here you can see a calotype of the chapel in its original location in the 19th century. So when Waverley was built in the 19th century, the chapel that we see here in the calotype was dismantled and the stones were numbered. I always like to think a bit like an IKEA flat pack, although a very fancy one, and placed on Regent Road near Carlton Hill, so you can see them there. And the plan was to rebuild the chapel in its entirety on another site, but this never happened. So today all we have is this, if I go back to it, this fragment of the chapel on Chalmers Close, which is now referred to as Trinity Apse, and which has had a range of interesting So the chapel in its original form was once part of a much larger foundation incorporating a collegiate church and hospital, which Mary was responsible for commissioning. And here we can see the chapel and hospital in their original location next to Leith Wynd, which was the old Roman road linking Edinburgh to the port of Leith to the north. And you can also see the Nor Loch, which is now Princes Street Gardens to the left there. And I have a slightly closer up shot there as well. But why did Mary choose to build it? The foundation charter dating to the 25th of March 1462 says that Mary's foundation was to be dedicated to the praise and honour of the Holy Trinity, the Virgin Mary, St Ninian the Confessor, and all saints. The buildings were to include a perpetual college or collegiate church, for 1 provost, 8 chaplains or prebendaries, and 2 choristers, who was to say masses for the souls of the royal family, including Mary's deceased husband James and his ancestors, Mary's natal ancestors from the ducal house of Guelders, and for Mary herself. So she's covering all bases there. The chapel was also to be Mary's final resting place. And in addition to the collegiate church, the hospital would house 13 poor beadsmen who were reliant on the Queen's charity. So what we see in Trinity is a grand statement of the Queen's role, I think, as a curator and custodian of familial and personal memory at a point when her husband's death was fresh in the Scottish political consciousness. Mary's presentation of herself, as we'll see, as a grieving pious widow, as expressed through her foundation, no doubt served an important political role, signalling her intention perhaps to remain unmarried in the wake of her husband's death, and maybe crystallising her identity as Queen Dowager in the process. The promotion of such an image must have had an especial significance given the Queen's relative youth at the point of James II's death. And it's likely that she would have been expected to remarry at this point, a decision that hadn't worked out so well for her predecessor, Joan Beaufort. Mary must have been aware then that the cultivation of an image of pious widowhood through a foundation such as this, at this particular moment, would prove advantageous when seeking to maintain custody of her son and retaining an active hand in the governance of the kingdom. So by pouring her efforts into Trinity, I think Mary was able to make a clear statement about her identity as the wife and mother of Scotland's kings. So it's often said that as the seeds of this project were sown just before James II's death, that Mary was merely sort of continuing the king's wishes when commissioning the foundation. So it's often said that she was just sort of carrying on his wishes. But I think this really overlooks the significant financial and personal interest that she took in the project, which was as much about individual as it was about familial commemoration. So as Jill Harrison puts it, Mary's care for all aspects of the chapel's construction and provision make it a personal as well as a spiritual project and a visible sign of her queenship. Contemporary documents are authenticated with the Queen's personal seal, which you can see in the corner there. And the prebendaries and beadsmen were expected to be on their best behaviour at all times. So the prebendaries were forbidden from keeping concubines or housekeepers. I like that they're put in the same bracket there. And they were also required to read and sing matins, high mass, vespers, and compline on a daily basis. After Mass, they were expected to approach the tomb and Mary's tomb, and sprinkle it with holy water using hyssop, saying the Psalm De Profundus to encourage further devotion. And the documents state that Mary reserved the right to make any changes at any point in which she liked. So only the apse, choir and transepts of Trinity Collegiate Church were completed during Mary's short widowhood, but the foundation's often been regarded by antiquaries and historians as one of the finest examples of medieval Gothic architecture in Scotland. The Queen invested over £1,000 on the project, and I'm going to steal Lizzie Swarbrick's famous phrase here from our Trinity Apps Open Day. She says that Mary had Elon Musk levels of wealth, so we have to think of it in these terms. The tierceron vault, bosses, and elaborate foliate carving, which are still present today in the rebuilt section of the chapel, are indicative of this grand and impressive mausoleum to the Queen. It's hard to imagine it now because it looks very grey, but it would have been very colourful and vibrant as well. So within the chapel was sumptuously furnished, containing images of the Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and Saints Margaret and Catherine. And many vessels and vestments displayed the Queen's arms as well. So Mary's choice to be buried within a foundation of her own making also demonstrated that she had sufficient wealth and status to afford this suitably impressive burial site, as well as providing a clear demonstration of her personal choice and agency. For medieval women, the location of their burial sites and the design of their tombs was a powerful means of asserting personal identity and of shaping the ways in which they would be remembered by their peers and subsequent generations, although obviously the Reformation got in the way of that for many of them. So in particular, the Queen's decision to be buried in her collegiate church rather than at Holyrood Palace with her husband was a strong statement of her own identity and status as Queen Dowager and mother to the King. The appearance of Mary's tomb is very sadly unknown due to its likely destruction during the Scottish Reformation. And we also don't know exactly where it was in the church either. But Thomas Tolley makes a pretty convincing argument, I think at least, for its prominent location in the east end of the church, behind the main altar, where it later would have been accompanied by the Trinity altarpiece, which is now one of the treasures in the National Gallery of Scotland. And I'm sure many of you have been to see it already, but if you haven't, I'd highly recommend going to see it, not only because it's amazing and monumental in its size, you don't really get a sense of the scale from these images, but also because it's in these 1930s glass cases, which make it really impossible to photograph. So I'm really sorry for the bad quality of my images, but you do have to go and see it in person, really, to be able to appreciate it. So the Trinity altarpiece, as some of you may have realised already, was commissioned approximately a decade after Mary's death. But despite this, the surviving panels, I think, are suggestive of the magnificence of the Queen's tomb and her foundation. The altarpiece was likely commissioned by Edward Bonkel, who was the first provost of Mary's foundation, from the Flemish painter Hugo van der Goes. The close relationship between Queen Mary and Bonkel, who appears to have lost popularity in royal circles after James's death, has also caused many scholars to think that he was likely fulfilling Mary's wishes when he commissioned this altarpiece. So this is a sort of posthumous extension of her lifetime legacy. Now, the iconography of the Trinity altarpiece, as we can see on the screen, combines religious and dynastic imagery to present an image of a devout ruling family. On their open side, the wings that we can see here show Mary's son, James III, and his wife, Margaret of Denmark, kneeling in prayer, where they're accompanied by Saints Andrew and George on either side. As you can see, well, I hope you can see, James is also joined by the couple's son, James IV, who mirrors his father's kneeling posture. And on either side, James and Margaret are framed by these lovely canopies of estate, which are located, as you can see, in a church setting as well. So on the back of the panels, the one of Margaret of Denmark, we have the altarpiece's patron, Edward Bonkel, who's at prayer, as you can see, in front of this organ with two angels. One of them's obviously playing it, and the other one's very playfully peeking out from behind it. And the reverse of the James II panel shows this enthroned Pietà scene where God the Father is cradling his dead son's body. Now, the mystery is the iconography of the central panel to whom the royal devotees pray. But there's strong evidence to suggest that Marian imagery, and most likely the coronation of the Virgin, formed the main subject. And here we can see a contemporary depiction of such an image from Dirk Bout. So it might have looked something like this, and this is something that Thomas Tolley suggests in his scholarship as well. Now, we know that the Virgin assumed an important place in Mary's foundation. So the 25th of March, the feast day of the Annunciation, was the date of the foundation charter, and the beadsmen notably wore this Marian blue uniform as well. There's also a clue in the Trinity altarpiece if you look very closely. And I did ask one of the attendants for a chair when I was visiting the National Gallery with a colleague, because this is quite high up and difficult to see. But as you can imagine, I was told no, and to contact the curator, but in a very, very polite way. So what we can see here is a wooden rood screen that's behind the wing of this angel, and I've just given you the larger image there to give you a context of where it is. And in this screen, we can see two existing images. So we've got the Annunciation of the Virgin and the coronation of the Virgin Mary there as well. So this sort of suggests to us, even though the remainder of the screen is out of view, the artist hasn't depicted it, that this is a sort of narrative sequence of the life of the Virgin that culminates in her coronation as Queen of Heaven. So the likelihood of the coronation of the Virgin as the subject of the missing central panel may also explain why Mary of Guelders seems to be absent from the existing imagery. Because this altarpiece otherwise celebrates dynastic succession and piety. So if the altarpiece did in fact accompany Mary's tomb, as has been suggested, the proximity of this Marian imagery in the altarpiece to the entombed body of the Queen of Scots would have no doubt encouraged flattering parallels to be drawn between earthly and heavenly queens. So it would sort of conflate the two and configure Mary's body and her memory in Marian terms. In praying to the Queen of Heaven, then, Margaret of Denmark and James III also pray to the earthly queen and mother who preceded them. Now, one final thing I want to point out with Trinity is that we might see it as an expression of the Queen's own identity through this sort of apparent blending of her natal and marital heritage. And we can see hints of this in both the physical fabric of the foundation and its location as well. So the construction of Trinity Kirk and Hospital was carried out under the direction of the Royal Master of Works, John Halkeston, and also David Boys. Now, Halkeston appears to have been local to Edinburgh. It's quite a popular name in the area. And his work can also be seen locally too, so in St Giles Kirk, St Salvator's in St Andrew, and the parish church of Duddingston as well. Although Richard Fawcett also makes the case for the likely involvement of Burgundian masons in the project, on the grounds of the style and craftsmanship of the chapel. So it's possible then that masons working under Halkeston were either brought over from the Burgundian court, or that they were drawing on a pre-existing Burgundian workforce that was already resident in Edinburgh. So either way then, we might say that the foundation's unique blending of Scottish and Burgundian styles is suggestive of the Queen's preference for artistic talent which honoured her own dual identity as a Queen of Scotland who'd been raised at the Burgundian court. The original location of the chapel as well in St Ninian suburb, so as I said earlier, next to the main road linking Edinburgh to the Port of Leith to the north, may have also referenced Mary's role as a peace weaver between Scotland and the continent. Due to its position on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and I think this image here sort of accentuates that very nicely, showing its sort of separation away from the city. Mary's foundation would have been encountered by many traders and visitors arriving and departing from overseas. And it's possible that this sort of liminal location that we can see on the edge of the city may have also had a sort of personal significance for Mary, because as we remember, she herself travelled from Leith to Edinburgh when she'd arrived over a decade earlier. So now then, I want to turn to a very different project, which shows another facet of Mary's role as regent. And here we have Ravenscraig Castle in Kirkcaldy in Fife, which is a military fortress located on a triangular promontory overlooking the strategically important Firth and Forth. And today the castle's in the care of Historic Environment Scotland, but I really love this image because, as you can see, we've got this 15th-century castle surrounded by this sort of industrial landscape with these tower blocks in the background there. So the castle's mainly ruined today. I don't know, some of you in the audience have probably visited it before. It's also inhabited by really aggressive birds. So I got dive bombed by them when I was there. So you sort of take your life in your hands when you go there. But in the 15th century, it was begun very energetically by Mary. So shortly before his untimely death, James II gifted the estate of Dysart to Mary and instructed his master of works, David Boys, who we met earlier, to build his queen a castle. So again, during her widowhood, Mary continued these works energetically, funding the project entirely from her own revenues. The Queen's known to have spent £600 Scots on Ravenscraig, but it could have been considerably more because the accounts for the first term after the King's death are unfortunately missing. So we don't necessarily have the whole picture of how much money she was spending on Ravenscraig. And as with Trinity, because Mary only had a 3-year widowhood, she died before the project was completed. But despite that, during her lifetime, substantial works were carried out, so including the digging of the Great Ditch, also the construction of the curtain walls, and the near completion of the Eastern Drum Tower, which we can see in this image here. And in its completed state, the royal castle was supposed to have two drum towers sort of running east to west. So it would have been quite similar, so that there would have been a great hall connecting those two towers over the main entrance. And it would have been quite similar to the arrangement of the Great Hall at Linlithgow Palace, for those of you who know that building well. Despite remaining unfinished, though, the castle, part of it at least, was inhabitable in Mary's lifetime, because in 1461, the Queen's steward stayed there for a period of 25 days with some of Mary's servants. And when Mary died, the flurry of works on the castle, it was begun very energetically, but when she died, that flurry of work ceases altogether. So I think, again, this is quite a good indication that she's really the driving force behind it. Now, from the outset, Ravenscraig was intended to have a really strong military appearance, and it's actually the earliest known example of a Scottish castle that was specifically designed to withstand cannon fire. So what might we make of this? Now, on one level, we might say that the design sort of functioned as a tribute to Mary's deceased husband's love of artillery, and we could place it within a wider programme of sort of commemorative architecture for James. But Mary herself also appears to have taken an active interest in military matters, as her presence at the siege of Blackness Castle in 1454 and at the siege of Roxburgh shortly after her husband's death both demonstrate. Now, during her son's minority, Mary also continued to show an active interest in military matters, so she purchased bombards and she employed gunners as well. She was also present at the Siege of Norham in 1463, where she showed support for the Queen of England, Margaret of Anjou, who we've met throughout the paper this evening. Now, like other women who exercised rulership on behalf of infirm or absent kings or male relatives, such as Isabella, Duchess of Burgundy, who we keep encountering, and also again Margaret of Anjou, both of whom were obviously personally known to the Queen, Mary was required to step into what was traditionally regarded as a more sort of masculine realm of activity, taking responsibility for raising revenues and troops during periods of conflict. In overseeing the building of a military castle then, Mary, we could say, was showcasing her willingness to make provisions for the military dimension of her role as governor of Scotland, while also ensuring that on a practical level, she had a defensible castle that she could run to if things got really ugly with the English. So now then, on this very cold and wet October evening, I want to take you away from the exposed coastal location of Ravenscraig to inland to Falkland Palace. So I'm sure that many of you have visited Falkland, which is now in the care of the National Trust for Scotland. Now, most of the palace that we see today is the product of building works by James V and Mary of Guelders in the 16th century. And they gave the palace this kind of refined Italianate style that we can see on the screen here. But prior to this, Falkland had been a medieval hunting lodge, which gradually evolved into this Renaissance pleasure palace. So many of the buildings that you see today post-date Mary's period of residence. But it does, these apartments do appear to have been built on medieval foundations. I think, as you can see here, the round tower, the stonework changes, so the two-thirds above are slightly different. I hope you can see that. So I'm grateful to Ian Campbell for pointing that out to me and saying, hang on, maybe there is actually part of the medieval palace still standing. Now, Mary came into the possession of the manor of Falkland in 1451, when she received the earldom of Fife as part of her marriage settlement. During their marriage, James II and Mary lavished quite a bit of attention on Falkland. So James raised the town to the status of a royal burgh in 1458, and a new gatehouse range was added to the palace during the 1450s as well. Now, after James's death, Mary spent a total of £35 Scots on her improvements to Falklands, and she concentrated largely on her own living quarters. She commissioned a new chamber for her own personal use, which was fitted with glass windows, which was quite a luxury at this point, and also an ombry, which is a sort of a small cupboard or recess that we find in churches as well. She also had a door fitted so that this chamber could lead directly onto a garden below as well. And she also added a gallery, so two other chambers were sort of partitioned off within this gallery. And I should also say that it's from Mary's period of widowhood that the references to the gardens at Falkland begin as well. So she clearly showed an active interest in the gardens there. Now, you might be thinking that compared to her expenditure on Trinity and Ravenscraig, this seems quite a minor amount of money to spend on Falkland. But I would say that these additions were important to the evolution of the site into a palace, and they also spoke to Mary's personal circumstances as cultivating, as I said earlier, this image of being a chaste and pious widow after her husband's death. In late medieval high-status residences, women's chambers were often located next to gardens due to the walled gardens' associations with the Virgin Mary, who was obviously the ultimate model of feminine perfection at the time. And elite women who were responsible for sort of creating or commissioning their own living space often created gardens as an expression of this sort of exemplary femininity. It's a way of sort of modelling themselves on the Virgin Mary. So at her palace at Greenwich, for example, Margaret of Anjou created a personal suite of apartments, and there she had a gallery which overlooked a privy, so a more private garden, and a great garden as well below. And when Isabella of Portugal, who we keep encountering in the paper as well, when she designed her new apartments at Bruges, she also commissioned a secret gallery in the garden wall, which was attached to her personal chambers. And it's worth noting that, that Duchess Isabella as well also took the hortus conclusus, so the walled or enclosed garden, as her personal emblem. And that's probably, again, because of its associations with the Virgin Mary. If you want to make yourself look good, just associate yourself with the Virgin Mary. So Mary of Guelders' creation of this chamber and this garden at Falkland Palace therefore created these opportunities for her to sort of self-fashion herself as this paragon of queenly femininity by sort of emphasizing her piety and her chastity. Now, something else I think is that given the sort of idyllic and rural location of the palace, Mary could have had plans to develop Falkland into a sort of spiritual retreat in her later years, because although she only had 3 years as a widow, obviously at that point she didn't know that that would be the case. So she was obviously thinking about these projects in the longer term. And Isabella as well also created a woodland retreat at Le Motte-à-Bois in the Forest of Nieupes. And there she, in 1457, she turned her attention to prayer and charity. And we might think that, you know, Mary's interest in hospitals and her devout and charitable works make it possible that she had similar ambitions for Falkland as well, but obviously that these didn't come to fruition, as I've said, because of her short widowhood. So the siting of Falkland would have facilitated this, I think, due to its woodland setting. So woods were very, you know, popular as sort of spiritual retreats. And also, again, due to the proximity to a number of religious sites, including, you know, major pilgrim routes as well, the pilgrimage route through to St Andrews, and hospitals. There's a lot of hospitals concentrated in that part of Scotland. And another thing that we find with Falkland, before we move on to my final case study this evening, is that it also, like with Trinity Collegiate Kirk and Hospital, it could also be said to define her as this agent of cultural transfer again, because the gallery that was commissioned by the Queen appears to have been an architectural innovation in a Scottish context, and it's the earliest recorded example of such a structure in Scotland, so it's really, really quite notable. And the novelty of the gallery, and I really like this, is reinforced by the fact that it's recorded in the accounts in the French. So there's obviously not a word in Scots for it at that point. So it's very conspicuous for the fact that it's a sort of imported structure from elsewhere. And again, you know, other contemporary women like Margaret of Anjou and Isabella of Portugal, who we keep meeting, they also commissioned galleries at their personal residences. So we could say that Mary was not only expanding her living quarters to, you know, suit her needs, like I need a bigger chamber because I'm more important now, but that she was also, you know, expressing her belonging to this wider continental female elite, all of whom were sort of using architecture to, you know, articulate these messages regarding their gender and their power and their status. Too far again. So the final example I want to turn to this evening is a building that everyone in this room undoubtedly knows very well, and that's the iconic St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, although it didn't, as many of you will know, didn't become a cathedral until the 17th century. But in Mary's lifetime, it was still a prominently positioned kirk on the main processional routeway between Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood Abbey, and it was notably the only parish kirk in the city. So, you know, it's an extremely important building. Now, in the 19th century, the antiquarian Cameron Lees suggested that the works carried out at St Giles in 1460, including the lengthening of the choir eastwards from the main altar, The heightening of the roof and the addition of clerestory windows were undertaken, at least in part, at Mary's instigation. And he suggested that this was a means of sort of, again, commemorating her husband. Now, the King's Pillar, which you can see in the east end of the church, and which has actually very recently been repainted, so it's a lot easier to see the shields on it now. It displays 4 coats of armorial bearings. So we've got those of the late King, James II, those of Mary of Guelders, those denoting an heir or prince, and the fleur-de-lis of France. And 2 neighbouring pillars also bear the arms of several men who were closely associated with the king, so including James Kennedy, the Bishop of St Andrews, and Nicholas Otterburn, who was vicar of the church, and he had also been among those who had selected Mary as the king's bride quite a few years earlier. So it's possible then that Mary worked alongside these men, all of whom were very closely associated to the king, to commemorate her husband through the architectural fabric of the kirk. Another clue to Mary's involvement in the changes to the fabric of St Giles can also be found in the surviving descriptions of the Great Bell, which unfortunately doesn't survive anymore because it was melted down. But it was cast in Flanders in 1460, and it bore the arms of Gelderland, as well as a figure of the Virgin and Child. But very excitingly, dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, that was carried out by Dr. Coralie Mills, who I know is in the online audience this evening, so hi to Coralie, and Hamish Darragh in 2020, has provided even more evidence to suggest Mary's likely involvement in the works at St Giles around this time. So Mills and Darragh dated there's an internal 5-story timber frame that supports the iconic crown spire today, and they dated this, and they found that the structure was very likely built during Mary's period as Queen Dowager. So the spire was altered considerably in 1653, but it originally dates to between 1460 and 1467. The other thing they found is that the timber that was used for this wooden frame inside the tower was also native to Scotland, and it originated from the Royal Forest of Darnaway. Now, this is particularly striking because at this point, most of the timber supplies in Scotland came from Scandinavia. So it's native timber, and it's also coming from a royal estate. So we have a strong indication that there's a royal patron involved. And the dates, they sit with Mary's period as regent as well. So it's very exciting. Even in the last couple of years, we're finding out new information that points to Mary's architectural patronage potentially being even more extensive than we'd previously realised. So to draw things to a close then, in just 3 years, Mary of Guelders made a significant mark, I hope I've shown, upon the Scottish landscape. The Queen's programme of building works is indicative of a woman of considerable power, wealth and status who sought to make provisions for all aspects of what she might have hoped to be a long life following her husband's death. Through her establishment of a collegiate church and hospital, a defensive stronghold and a luxurious set of living quarters, Mary of Guelders ensured that all aspects the spiritual well-being of herself and her family were taken care of, that she had a defensible castle in the context of a changing political climate, and a fashionable retreat which showcased her piety and her belonging to a continental female elite. While Mary's commemorative projects emphasised her role as widow and mother, they nevertheless provided opportunities for self-definition within a familial framework, which she exploited to her advantage. In choosing to be buried in a foundation of her own making, separate from her husband at Holyrood, Mary demonstrated that she had the wealth and status to commission a suitably impressive burial site, making a powerful statement of her own identity as Queen of Scots in the process. At Ravenscraig, the Queen ensured that she made provisions for the military aspects of her role as governor of the kingdom. At Falkland, she created comfortable living quarters at a palace which, had she lived longer, would have provided the ideal base from which to enact her philanthropy and her piety. The Queen's architectural patronage also appears to have expressed her identity as a foreign-born consort, who acted as an intercessor between Scotland and the continent. In commissioning a gallery at Falkland, a feature hitherto unrecorded in Scotland up until that point, Mary created a living space which chimed with this sort of spatial grammar of female power that had been adopted by other women that she knew. The style of Trinity Collegiate Kirk, with its mixture of these Scottish and Burgundian styles, along with the location of Mary's Chapel and Hospital, poised between Edinburgh and the port of Leith, also suitably conveyed the Queen's unique identity as a link between Scotland and Europe. So Mary's death in 1463 meant that her major building projects of Trinity Collegiate Church and Hospital and Ravenscraig Castle remained unfinished. Following the Queen's death, Ravenscraig passed to the Sinclair family. Falkland Palace, as we've seen, was extensively remodelled during the reigns of James IV and V, and Trinity Collegiate Kirk and Hospital was sidelined in favour of James III's own collegiate foundation at Wresselrig. Yet despite their potted afterlives, the surviving fragments of Mary's building projects that have endured through to the present day are a testament to Mary's remarkable life and hold the potential to tell her story to the many residents and visitors to Scotland. So notable in this regard are the efforts of the Trinity Network, which is led by Jill Harrison. And I know that many of you in this room attended the Trinity App's open day back in May, and you would have enjoyed Lizzie's wonderful tour during that morning. So the aim of this network is to tell the stories of the apps, which is this remarkable heritage asset that just a stone's throw from the Royal Mile, to an audience beyond merely interested academics and scholars, wonderful though they are. And on that note, I should say actually that some of you may have spotted that there's a survey going around. So there are some at the back of the room there, strategically placed, I think, next to the wine. So Jill Harrison and I are currently working on an article thinking about the apps as a sort of potential heritage attraction and its value to people in Edinburgh. So if you do have time before you leave this evening, if you'd be willing to fill out the survey, we'd be really grateful for any responses that you can give. Now, in her excellent recent publication, Where Are the Women? A Guide to an Imagined Scotland, Sarah Sheridan asks, can you imagine a different Scotland? A Scotland where women are commemorated in statues and streets and buildings? But sometimes we don't have to imagine. As we've seen this evening, Mary of Guelders materially defined her own legacy in a landscape otherwise dominated by men through her building projects. Our job, and perhaps our challenge now, is to ensure that that legacy remains visible for future generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for that very interesting lecture on these 4 key buildings in Edinburgh, from the High Kirk across to Falkland in Fife. It was also perhaps appropriate to remark tonight that, of course, some of the recent repainting and improvements in St Giles were due to support from Sir Angus Grossop, for whom there was a commemorative service in St Giles relatively recently, and who was a great benefactor of this society over recent years. The kind of formal part of tonight's business, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Heather Pulliam to do a vote of thanks.
So I do want to say thank you for such an incredibly well-rounded paper, and it did feel like this dynamic woman that I keep thinking of the Falkland windows, that she was just constantly looking out, and all of her projects were sort of outward looking and making these kind of connections. And it felt like your paper was doing the same thing, taking us around the world through various disciplines, and showing all these connections that are sort of woven through. So I do want to say thank you, and I'm sure everyone would like to join me in thanking you for such a fantastic paper. So thank you.
Thank you indeed. My last bit of business for tonight is to let you know about the next lecture in our series, which will be on hunter-gatherer Ireland by Professor Graham Warren of UCD. Booking for that is already open. The meeting after that will be our anniversary meeting on the 30th of November, which will include the next fellowship election and a short talk by Dr. Nella Scholmer-Mason on an early female antiquary in Orkney. So thank you everybody, to our audience here and beyond. And I'd now like to invite you and our speaker especially to a glass of wine at the back of the room. Thank you everybody.